faces. And I know where you're at is kind of like this land of mystery, kind of new territory. Everything feels new. I personally remember just having so many fears of, am I doing this right? Am I going to screw this up, right? When I started my blessing. And then that kicked into high gear, like these insecurities when I became a father. Because I think a lot of us are told that marriage is hard, that being a parent is hard. And they definitely can be, but it's actually the most natural thing in the world. And it's really learning how to let go of kind of your selfishness and this concept that you are just an individual, and learning how to embrace somebody else. That's the process of two becoming one. Okay? You were an individual, and now you've engrafted into a couple. You are going through the process of becoming a couple. And I know some of you, many of you, live still separately from your spouse. And so that will happen through conversations that you have online, maybe through prayer, through many different ways, right? But the process of going from an individual to a couple is one of really letting go of your old self. Because when we're single, it's really just a matter of taking care of ourselves, making sure that we are eating well, sleeping well, you know, doing all the stuff that we're supposed to do. And then when you become a couple, it's learning how to serve the other person, okay? So this whole talk is really about how to graduate from being an individual and all the kind of self-centeredness that comes along with that, which is a part of our development, and learning how to become other-centered, yeah? And so one concept that I would love for you to understand is that 1 + 1 = 3 in terms of relationships. Because there's you, there's your spouse, and then there's the relationship that you're in. If you can imagine, two people are in a bubble, and that bubble is your relationship. So every time you talk to each other, you're feeding the oxygen in that bubble. And if it's healthy communication, then it's feeding this bubble really good oxygen, really good energy. And this relationship that you're in becomes stronger and more resilient. But the more that you focus on yourself and self-centeredness and this kind of stuff, the more you weaken this relationship that you're in. This core concept, I think, is something that I constantly am measuring my relationship in. It's not just how am I doing, or just how is my wife doing, but how is this relationship doing? Your relationship, I would love for you to think of it as a living, breathing organism. That's actually your first child. Before you have a physical child, the first child you, based on the divine principle, right? The 4-position foundation is everything that comes out of the couple. And the first thing that comes out of you is your relationship itself. I hope this makes sense. It's not, I don't want it to be too kind of esoteric. It's really practical. Every time you think about your spouse, you are feeding your relationship either good stuff or unhealthy stuff. So things like resentment. If your spouse kind of says something and they make you angry, and you focus on that and you just think about it a lot, then you're kind of poisoning the relationship in a sense. But every time you pray for that person, every time you learn how to forgive them or to get beyond your concepts of them, you're feeding this relationship this really powerful vitality, okay? This is a massive part of 1 + 1 = 3. That's the first concept that I would really love for you guys to understand, is that every interaction, even just with yourself, thinking, feeling, is feeding the relationship something. But also, especially when you communicate, it's feeding the relationship either good stuff that's making it stronger, unhealthy stuff that's weakening it. The second thing I would love for you guys to understand is the idea of squeezing, okay? When you have two different individuals who their world has been just them their whole lives, and now they're entering a relationship, there's like this merging that happens. It's kind of like two energies becoming one is this squeezing process, okay? And a lot of times, what we're doing without us knowing is we're trying to squeeze the other person to fit into our world, to be more like us. And this is a very self-centered thing that we've been doing our whole lives, right? We hang out with people who make us feel good, who fit into our concept of what a good friend is. But now that you're married, now that you're blessed in the blessing, I would love for you to be able to observe when you're trying to squeeze the other person to become more like you, okay? Because what you're doing then is you're making them feel squeezed. I don't know if you've ever been controlled by somebody before, if somebody's trying to say, you're doing this wrong, whatever, and they're making you feel kind of like not so great because they're trying to turn you into something that you're not. It's not a nice feeling. I think we've all experienced that, either by parents, by a boss, by a teacher. It's not that they're trying to help us to grow. Sometimes people are just honestly trying to change us so that we can be more like they want us to be. But I would love for you to understand that this is something that will happen in your relationship, that you say, I don't like the way you do that. You need to do like this. And in a sense, we're trying to squeeze them into what we want them to be, rather than, which is very kind of self-centered, rather than loving them unconditionally and supporting their growth from our perspective, okay? So if you're a more kind of dominating person, more subjective person, it's easy to squeeze other people. And that can happen in terms of like, I want you to dress like this. I don't like that outfit. You know, like changing the way they look. I don't like the way that you pray. There's stuff like that. But you can't imagine how much this comes into the bedroom with sexuality, especially if you have a history of fantasizing about what sex is like. It's very easy to try to get the other person to be something that they're not, so that they can fit into what you want, which is squeezing them. And this is a really unhealthy habit that I've observed in myself and in many other people, something that it's like a skill that you have to learn, which is to not manipulate or change other people, right? This is the energy of squeezing. So that's the subjective people. But objective people, I would love for you to also understand that many times we can be pressured into doing stuff that we don't want to do, that we're not ready for, that goes against what our instincts, our conscience is telling us. And in those moments, we are kind of giving up our own personal power and our connection to our conscience, to our mind, in order to be squeezed, okay? And this is just a dynamic that will happen naturally. It's not necessarily bad. It's if you can catch it and learn from it, then you can learn how to stop trying to squeeze each other and to change each other so much, and to learn how to really genuinely love each other unconditionally. Because stuff like sexuality is really about opening your mind and opening your heart to each other. It's a very vulnerable place. So there's the idea of obviously being physically naked during the act of sex. And that's one thing, but What's even in many ways harder is to become emotionally and spiritually completely naked. This is the idea of being naked and unashamed from the Bible, is to really just be like, I'm here for you. And for a lot of us, we've been hurt in different ways. It's hard for us to fully trust somebody else. And in your relationship, everything is new, and you don't have to put so much pressure on yourself to be perfect at all. That's a really bad kind of goal. It's more just really opening up your minds and your hearts to each other and learning how to think about the other person's needs. Okay? So we're talking about selfishness, but the opposite of selfishness is kind of serving. And I think we have a lot of concepts about serving. Serving feels like you're kind of in a lower position when you're serving somebody, like a servant. When in reality, to serve somebody with a real depth of love and gratitude and honor, that's what God does for us all the time. Heavenly Parent serves us all the time. That's what parents do for children. And it's something that you can learn to do for each other. And so I have some questions that you can ask. And this is about generally life, but also in terms of sexuality. It's so good to check in with each other. So again, many of us just want the other person to be the way that we want them to be, to kind of fit into what we need them to be. And that's very selfish. But the serving model is checking in with them, asking them, are you okay? Is it okay if how are you feeling? And you can imagine if you wake up and you look at your spouse, let's just say in the future, when you guys are living together, for those of you who aren't, and you look at your spouse first thing in the morning, and your first question is not, hey, can you do this for me? But rather, how are you today? How can I know you better today? How can I love you better today? Maybe you say this, maybe you just feel this, but imagine the difference in energies that you're giving out. Not just in the beginning of your relationship, but years into your relationship. Okay? And if you have that kind of energy, it's that of serving. I want to learn how to love you better every day. That's emotionally, but it's also substantially. And when it comes to sexuality, if that is your heart, then God will be there. If two people are really focused on serving and loving each other to the highest degree, then God is really excited about that relationship. If two people are just trying to take from each other, then God has no space in that energy. There's no room in there for God, because it's really just people in their minds and their kind of selfish emotions, their bad habits, whatever. And so this sounds nice, right? But it also sounds very lofty. And I want to let you know that, like in my personal relationship with my wife, we've been blessed over 11 years. And it was a very clunky beginning. I don't know if any of you did the dancing ministry that was in our church for a while, but like learning how to dance in the beginning is kind of embarrassing. It's kind of a disaster because you're just stepping on each other's toes. You know you look stupid. I remember my wife is Mongolian and she's very strong. And so when we would dance, I'd try to be the man and kind of like lead her, and she would fight back, and it was like an arm wrestling match. And we were just trying to figure out who's leading this thing. And I had lessons and she hadn't. And she's like, let me show you. And I was like, good Lord. But that's just the dynamic of any relationship. And when it comes to sexuality, I want you to understand it's very, very similar, that in the beginning, you're trying to get through many of the emotions and many of the, I don't understand what I'm doing, like this newness. And that's all fine and good. You know, you don't need to be good at anything in the beginning. That's crazy. But if you have the right motivation and desire, you'll be led to find out the best way to serve each other and to love each other emotionally, spiritually, substantially, okay? And I just want to let you know that, like, my wife and I, you guys don't need to know any details, but honestly speaking, the first few years of our marriage were very kind of awkward sexually. We had a child very soon after we got blessed, and then we were off to the races, always busy, always doing all this stuff. And it took us a few years to really get into the rhythm of serving each other. In the beginning, it was more just like, hey, I need sex, or, you know, it was just, you know, we were doing what we could. We didn't have a course like this. But as years went on, we got much better at talking about, hey, how are you feeling? Are you in the mood? During the act of sex, even talking, hey, how are you doing? How is this for you? Are you okay? Are you in the mood? Always constantly connecting. Because they say that the biggest and greatest and most important sexual organ is your mind, right? And if your mind is distracted, or if your heart is distracted, or your spirit is distracted, or your body is distracted, then you're not really together. And this is what I want to kind of close on. This is something that we've been focusing a lot in High Noon, is learning how to have dominion over your mind, over your heart, over your spirit, so that you can tell your body to be fully present for each other. And if two people have their minds on each other, they're really focused on each other's needs and are really mindful of each other, really aware of each other. This is throughout your day when you're eating meals. Oh, you look thirsty. Would you like a drink? How nice is that? But it's also in the bedroom. You know, when your minds are really on each other, not your own needs, but the other person's needs, and your heart is really invested in how that other person feels, and your spirits are trained well enough to do what you want for the other person instead of your own selfish needs. That's spiritual, right? To dominate your body with your spirit. And lastly, your bodies serve each other. So your mind, your heart, your spirit, and your body. Body's last, by the way. When these are all in line with each other, two people, that's Chanel Guk. That's when two become one. And it's not easy. And you won't have 100% track record of doing that all the time. Because sometimes we forget and we become selfish again. And we just focus at learning about the other person, learning how to serve them and love them the way that they want to be loved and served. You will get masterful at that. You will become a master in that other person, and you will know them better, maybe than they even know themselves. And when you do that, you will create a chemistry where you will love each other so much more, because you've invested the mental effort, the emotional effort, the spiritual effort, and the physical effort in each other, and you will become more and more in love as time goes by. That's what happens when you're being intentional with your love, rather than needy and selfish and emotional, which is what we will do if we're not careful. It takes effort. It's a muscle. Caring about people is a muscle that requires daily effort. Aunt Mitsue and Uncle David know it. They've been blessed the longest out of anybody here. And it takes continual effort. But it gets easier with time, and you create momentum when you every day learn how to focus on loving the other person more. And again, that's practically just around the house, but it's also, especially in the bedroom, very clear. If you really invest in loving each other the way that God loves you, your sex will get better and better and better over time, into old age, into spirit world. That's what true parents talked about.